From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about the recent political upheaval in Pakistan. The country went through a political and constitutional crisis this spring that culminated in the ouster of the charismatic populist Prime Minister Imran Khan on April 9th. Khan tried to block the no-confidence vote that removed him by dissolving parliament, but was subsequently overruled by the Supreme Court. Pakistan's new Prime Minister, Shahbaz Sharif, is expected to serve until the next general elections, which are scheduled to take place in 2023. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. There's a lot to discuss today, but thankfully we've got three great guests joining us in the program: Marvin Weinbaum, Madiha Afzal, and Syed Mohammad Ali. Marvin is the director of MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan program. Madiha is a fellow in the foreign policy program at Brookings. Her work focuses on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, U.S. policy towards Afghanistan, Pakistan's politics and policy, and extremism in South Asia and beyond. She's also the author of Pakistan Under Siege, Extremism, Society, and the State. Mohammad Ali has extensive experience working with multilateral, bilateral, government, and non-government organizations on varied international development challenges. He's a non-resident scholar with MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan program and a weekly columnist for Pakistan's Express Tribune. Marvin, Madiha, Mohammad Ali, welcome back to the program, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Alistair.
Thank you.
Mohammad Ali, let's start with you. When did things start to go wrong for Imran Khan, and kind of what ultimately contributed to his ouster as you see it?
Well, I would say from the get-go, I remember his elections very clearly, and his use of electables, the so-called people who can be called old wine in new bottles, started coming to the fore. So that was the first blow to his credibility and as someone who was going to bring justice and change to Pakistan. And subsequently, increasing friction within his party, including with Jahangir Tareen, one of his main financiers, who by the Supreme Court had become the scapegoat while both of them, Imran Khan and Jahangir Tareen, were being scrutinized for their credentials. Jahangir Tareen was sort of, sidelined and had to resign the next year as the general secretary of the PTI. And there were other prominent members within the PTI who were held responsible for kind of pushing him out, and then subsequently him creating like a forward block. And so that kind of internal fracture. And then so many U-turns by the Imran Khan government, his promises of never going to the IMF, of scrutinizing CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor projects, the governance problems, particularly the appointment of a very inexperienced chief minister of the Punjab, which is the most populous province in Pakistan, his reluctance to devolve power, creating a myopic national single curriculum, which was in his populist imagining, trying to create a curriculum that would level the playing field, between the elite and those who go to public schools, but having done neither, right? And more ultra-nationalism sort of, being integrated into the already problematic curriculum, foreign policy debacles, going back to first, deciding to attend a Malaysian summit in 2020 where Turkey and Malaysia wanted Pakistan to kind of come in and present an alternative to the Saudi dominance of the Muslim world, but then feeling the pressure from Saudi and not joining that summit. His stance on Afghanistan, although it's not entirely Imran Khan's stance, but, saying things like the Taliban have broken the shackles of slavery, the growing anti-American sentiment, sort of tapping into that, and that's something we can probably come back to again. And lastly, the last straw on the camel's back was, this increasing tension with the military, particularly over the appointment of the spy chief, the ISI chief. And while he ultimately capitulated to the military's desire, sort of his reluctance to do so created a signal that the military is no longer behind him. So things had been going wrong for a while, and it culminated in his subsequent no confidence.
So fair to say that it was an array of things that had built up over a period of the last 4 years. Marvin, Pakistan went through a constitutional crisis when Khan tried to dissolve parliament to avoid his removal. What were your kind of takeaways from how that whole process played out? What do you think it tells us about Pakistan's political and judicial systems?
Actually, when we talk about playing out, I believe that what we saw here was a constitutional crisis and a political crisis. The opposition parties had been gunning for Imran Khan, of course, throughout his entire incumbency. When they were finally able, and that means an array of parties that have very little in common, to agree at least that this was a propitious time to remove Khan, at that point, when they got through hook and crook, as it's expressed, when they finally got a majority, as it turned out, a very narrow majority, to remove him from office, it was clear, and we know what this is like, where the head of state or head of government just refuses to leave. And Imran Khan was determined to stay on and brought on this constitutional crisis, as you suggested earlier, by getting the deputy speaker in the parliament to block the taking of any vote on this issue, and then to suspend the parliament itself, dissolve the parliament. So we had a real crisis here, and it seemed to be a true impasse. Into this stepped the military finally. They did so very quietly. They've been arguing rather strenuously for some time that they're totally neutral on this. Well, the military is never neutral. But what was clear, as Muhammad Ali has already suggested, what was clear here is that they were prepared by their inaction to take action. And that is what they would have normally supported the government. They have been supporting this government for some time. In fact, their relationship with Imran Khan goes back at least 12 years when he was almost by himself as a politician. Well, what I'm getting at here is that we now have seen, as a major takeaway, as if we needed a reminder, that the military is still very much part of this process. The Supreme Court stepped in also to assure that there was going to be some way out of this impasse. I think that it is and we can come back to this, as certainly we've reached here a situation in Pakistan, a political situation here, which is fraught with all kinds of dangers. And I think we're just at the beginning of seeing what kind of damage can be created here. And we'll develop more on this line as we go along, I'm sure.
Yeah, I want to get you in here as well. The new Prime Minister, Shahbaz Sharif, is the brother of Pakistan's three-time PM, Nawaz Sharif, and a former Chief Minister of Punjab province. How is he perceived in Pakistan? What do we know about his priorities and agenda?
You know, how he's perceived in Pakistan is a tough question because Pakistan is an extremely polarized country right now. So we can talk about how he's perceived among supporters of the PDM, the Pakistan Democratic Movement that ousted Khan and that is in power right now. And then we can talk about how he's perceived by PTI supporters, Khan supporters, and their diametrically opposed visions. But in general, Shahbaz Sharif is someone who was chief minister of Punjab 3 times. He's someone who is seen as a person who can get things done, sort of a taskmaster. Somebody who works long hours, was at the office at 7 a.m. and would work late into the night. And in fact, that's one of the policies he's instituted in coming to national office is to have a 6-day work week for government officials. But his priorities in Punjab were really sort of in terms of sort of highly visible projects, infrastructure projects mainly. So the metro bus system in Lahore, building roads and highways, building underpasses, especially in the urban areas. Also, in terms of sort of these highly visible projects, he had these laptop schemes that handed out laptops to schools and to students. For his supporters, he's seen as someone who is a practical person who gets things done. To PTI supporters, he is part of the dynastic and corrupt elite of Pakistan that has ruled Pakistan for basically the entire democratic period, starting from 1988 to 99, and then again from 2008 to 2018. Of course, his brother was a 3-time former prime minister, and then the other major party in the PDM, the PTI supporters also see as highly corrupt. That's the PPP. So to them, they'll decry all of this reputation of his that comes from infrastructure projects, etc., and point to corruption cases and money laundering cases. And in fact, PTI supporters and Khan himself have dubbed Shahbaz Sharif as quote unquote a crime minister, starting with a C instead of a P. So in any case, sort of going to what we can expect while Mr. Sharif is in office, as I said, one of his major policies having come into office has already been to start this 6-day work week for government officers. But he inherits an economic crisis. And part of this is something that's going on the world over, right? Given Russia's invasion of Ukraine, given inflationary pressures. And part of it is Pakistan specific with the slide of the rupee versus the dollar and a Pakistan specific economic crisis. The problem here is that the PDM, had been calling for Khan's ouster. It was formed 2 years ago, or nearly 2 years ago in the fall of 2020. But essentially, since 2018, the opposition parties had been clamoring for Khan's ouster. And the PDM formed with this explicit purpose in 2020. What made their efforts stick this spring, as has been articulated already by Marvin and by Mohammed, is the fact that Khan had lost the support of Pakistan's military. So suddenly the PDM found themselves with a successful effort, something they had been trying to do for years now, but they found that their efforts to oust Khan were suddenly successful. The problem is that their goal was to oust Khan, and they didn't really have an articulated plan of action for when they were in office. And I think we are seeing some of those kind of teething troubles for the new government in the form of the lack of an articulated policy approach sort of coming out right now. Of course, Khan is acting as an obstructionist, agitational opposition politician, trying to get this government to call for early elections. And I'm sure we'll get into that. And that is also making the environment such that this new government, Sharif's government, is essentially in the business of putting out fires, constantly responding to Khan instead of getting down to the business of governing. But the lack of a policy articulation is one thing. And then the other thing I'll say is the fact that Shahbaz Sharif still shows sort of signs of seeing himself as the number 2 person in the party, with Nawaz Sharif, his brother, who was the 3-time former prime minister, as the number 1 person. Of course, now Nawaz Sharif is in London. And in fact, this week, Shahbaz Sharif and senior officials in his government are in London to consult with Nawaz Sharif on sort of the major crises that Pakistan is facing right now. So sort of the question of power centers, is it Nawaz, is it Shahbaz, is also coming up. But that being said, I think there are some really important moves that Shahbaz Sharif has made in terms of having an inclusive government when it comes to, of course, bringing the PPP on board. This is the first time that there is, sort of this national unity government, and that these two parties, which were formerly at loggerheads in the 1990s, the PPP and Shahbaz Sharif's PMLN, are now in government together, appointing Bilawal Bhutto from the PPP as his foreign minister, and then also bringing in people from the Pashtun areas, traveling, an MNA, a prominent MNA, Mohsin Davar, having him be part of the delegation on his first foreign trip, having somebody from Balochistan be part of the delegation on his first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia. These are important measures when it comes to inclusivity and something to be lauded.
Muhammad Ali, I wanted to circle back to Imran Khan. He remains widely popular. He's held a series of massive rallies since his ouster, which he's blamed on U.S. meddling, and called for a march on Islamabad later this month. How do you view his prospects going forward, and do you think a comeback is possible?
Well, Alistair, Khan's championing of Islamophobia has made him popular within Pakistan and elsewhere in the Muslim world. There are some problems with how he's had a limited view of Islamophobia, right? And where he sees that as a problem. I mean, largely he's been critical of it in the US and in Europe, but not so much. In fact, not at all in China and its bigger problem. But that and his own brand of populism and anti-American sentiment, right? I mean, they seem to be serving him well. I mean, he has now, without even sort of the blessings of the establishment, been pulling very impressive crowds, in Lahore and Karachi, in the KP. And it's understandable when one looks at the frustration of the youth, the urban youth, but also the rural youth with access to social media now, the frustrations of the middle class, where the middle class has started experiencing from earlier growth now a kind of a stagnation. And there are many reasons in Pakistan for anti American sentiment. I mean, it's been around, Pew surveys suggest, for a good couple of decades now. While not everyone believes in this kind of conspiracy theory in which Imran Khan has kind of also tried to implicate politicians bordering on sort of treason. And it seems exaggerated, this conversation between diplomats, between the Pakistani ambassador and the Assistant Secretary of State, American Assistant Secretary of State. It wasn't regime change, but of course, we know that the US, from Mossadegh to the Chilean Allende government and elsewhere, in regime change by the use of force, directly and indirectly, from Libya to Iraq to Afghanistan, there is this history and this very turbulent phase of finger pointing between the US and Pakistan over the past 20 years. Pakistan being one of those countries which has been dubbed the most sanctioned ally, right? Frontline state, but then all this suspicion and acrimony on both sides, and for a variety of reasons. So Imran Khan is, he's trying to sort of build this narrative, this populist narrative, which has served other strongmen like Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka. I mean, now with the economic situation, we're seeing the Rajapaksas come down, but it served the ethno-nationalism across the border in India has served the Modi governments very well, right? So Imran Khan is trying to sort of, whip up this long-standing disgruntlement to his own political advantage. But the problem is that while Khan is gunning for elections because he feels that he can win, he has a fighting chance. And I think that while there is sort of, this falling out with the military, I think that he would jump at the chance of some kind of a reconciliation with the Pakistani military, which would certainly amplify his chances of coming back to power. But his coalition partners, former coalition partners, and also voices within the current government, it's interesting, like Madiha said, that the PMLN and the PPP are sitting together in government, but they are voices, within the government that they don't want to see the current economic sort of catastrophe bordering on catastrophe and meltdown to become the fault of this government, which has come in at the tail end. So they are also wanting to distance themselves, and they hope that this kind of disgruntlement and the inflation and the isolation of Pakistan, and they can present an alternative vision. But that coalition will not hold between the PPP and the PMLN if there are general elections. So they will be wooing the same voters. So there is this challenge, and if somehow the current government, the Shahbaz Sharif government, can manage to put the economic house in order, which means curbing inflation and the global factors. The war in Ukraine, it's lingering sort of mismanagement of debt, IMF pressure, which can hurt the poor, those policies in the desire to stabilize the fiscal deficit, those austerity measures are not good for a coming election. Saudi and China seem quite reluctant to bail out Pakistan currently. So it's not an easy situation. There is a lot of uncertainty. The army chief has to be appointed. His term is ending. Then the Shahbaz Sharif government, while he is working hard, there is this tarnished image of corruption over the Sharifs. They tried to weaponize blasphemy because their entourage was sort of attacked by PTI supporters in Saudi. And they tried to weaponize this notion of blasphemy, that why did sort of protesters confront them, in the holy spaces. They have also been using, ironically, censorship laws, which the Imran Khan government had given more teeth to, and using them now against the PTI. So now the real question is, what will the military do? Will it remain neutral? Will Imran Khan be able to reach some kind of compromise? Because the military also seems caught between a rock and a hard place. But I'll pause here, and perhaps, we'll take up the issue of the military subsequently.
Great. Thanks, Mohammad Ali. Madiha, I want to get your thoughts on the election issue as well. The next elections are scheduled to take place next year, but Khan has repeatedly called for early elections. And as Muhammad Ali just laid out, there are some reasons why the governing coalition may want to support that as well. What's your read? What do you think the likelihood that they'll be held on an early basis is? And who do you think would be more likely to benefit if that were the case?
Right. I think Khan has made it clear that he wants early elections. I mean, once it became clear that the vote of no confidence was going to succeed against him, he repeatedly tried to get the opposition, now this governing coalition, to agree to early elections through pressure from the military. I mean, he wanted to deny them the political space to be in power, the runway they currently have in power right now. And he thought that he would benefit from early elections. At this point, with the way he's been conducting rallies, albeit in Pakistan's urban areas, but huge rallies that bring out his base and optics-wise are good for him in terms of showcasing his support. At this point, I think he has a momentum. And so he would want elections to be held as soon as possible. But even if elections were held right now, it is unclear that Khan's urban support base, those people that he brings out to the rallies, can help him win in a parliamentary system where what matters is whether you have the right electables, these locally powerful politicians, who provide patronage in their constituencies and who are sort of dynastically powerful local politicians, whether he has enough electables on his side. Khan has also said that he has learned from his experience in the past, and he won't use the same old electables, the ones who switch parties, because he's been burned by that. So he'll have some clean slate of electables. Now, it's very unclear whether those candidates can actually help him win the parliamentary election. So that's a big question. But for the government on the other side, for this governing coalition, they've said that they want to put in place some electoral reforms to try to ensure a free and fair election, and that they don't want elections to be held before electoral reforms. Former President Zardari and the current Foreign Minister Bilawal, both part of the PPP, came forward and have said this. But there is this question of the longer this government is in power, the more attributable the performance of Pakistan's economy will be to this government. And so if it can turn things around, that would be great for it. And so it'll want to stretch that time period. But if it cannot, and there's a question of how much control does it really have, given sort of external conditions, how much control does it really have over turning things around in sort of the period of a few months to a year, then the runway might actually end up hurting the Sharif government and the governing coalition. And as Muhammad Ali pointed out, these two parties will be going against each other, and the PPP and the PMLN will be running against each other in the general election. So it'll be a weaker set of parties because they're not banded together essentially against Khan. I think just two other things that I want to mention. One is, does the PMLN bring Nawaz Sharif back to Pakistan? That will help them. That will also help the PTI in the sense that the PTI will be able to say, look, all his corruption cases are forgotten, and this is what these parties do. So they'll have a narrative, but Nawaz Sharif is a charismatic 3-time former prime minister who will be able to drum up more support for the PMLN. And the final thing I'll say is that there's the question of the electables, right? And whether Khan will be able to get enough electables on his side, or whether it'll be the PMLN essentially, because the PMLN is powerful in Punjab. And whoever wins Punjab essentially ends up winning the federal government, whether it will be them who have the electables on their side. One factor that has historically determined where the electables tend to go is the support of Pakistan's military. So that will become an important factor. Will the military stand back, or will it, tilt one way or the other? Will it tilt towards the PMLN, ensuring that the electables flow there? I mean, I think that is the big question. So at this point, I think there's a tug of war between the PTI and the governing coalition in terms of when they want elections to be held. And it's a particularly volatile situation when it comes to the constant polarization and essentially the constant sparring that is going on between Khan and this governing coalition. It's unclear. I think it's an unstable situation, and it's really unclear at this point whether elections are going to be held sooner rather than later. But I think there are some constraints. And one is essentially the Election Commission basically saying, look, elections cannot be held before a certain date. And so my sense is they're not going to be held anytime in the next 3 to 4 months, but anytime after that might be fair game.
Marvin, I want to get you in here as well. Given all of Pakistan's economic problems, which everybody has, I think, touched on at this point, how much room to maneuver do you think the government really has? And what can it do to address some of these issues in its relatively short time in office? And how do you think that affects its kind of electoral calculus?
Well, I think that the economy is going to be ultimately what this interim government will be judged on. And it will be what it is able to accomplish, but also what is unable to accomplish during this period of time. We've already talked so much about the economy that I don't know how much I can add except to say that it's in trouble. Of course, it's been a troubled economy for a long time, so that's not new, but it seems to be becoming more acute, and its implications for the political system, of course, have already been alluded to. But here we have extraordinarily high inflation, which of course is impacting those who are least able. The elites can manage this. They've got money parked elsewhere, and they'll be able to survive this, and in some ways may even take advantage of it. But the country is really hurting because the staples in the economy really have just skyrocketed in prices. It's a country with this enormous debt overhang. A large part of it of late, of course, has been these loans from the Chinese as part of their program to provide basically better infrastructure for the country, and with promise of assistance as well to the development in a broader sense, including the economy. That has not happened. What I'm getting at here is that here's a country that in order to be able to avoid bankruptcy, and that shouldn't be at all ruled out, in order to avoid bankruptcy, given the debt payments that it has to make, has to lean back here on the IMF, which it has found dependent so much of the time. The IMF and the government have been in negotiations for some time. They are still at loggerheads over how to wind up these. Ultimately, it comes down to the IMF, as usual, is making demands that the government finds would be politically dynamite for it to entirely accept. The truth is, though, that they are going to have to accept this. And I know there's an argument being made here, if you're going to do it, get it over with right away. Get it off the table. You don't want to carry that in any further. But we'll see what happens with that. The government is also facing what every other country is facing, and that is higher international prices. And so much of what it has to import, particularly, of course, here, oil, has been affected. Oil prices are at an all-time high, and this is impacting the country. The country has also seen its economy being pressed by the climate issue, which has really come home to roost, especially as we see in this month here of record-breaking temperatures, particularly in the Sindh, but really across the entire country and the entire subcontinent. This is having an economic impact. The efficiency of the economy obviously is affected as people find it more difficult to carry out their normal economic operations. So for a country that has gone through so much economically, there doesn't seem to be any easy way out. I will add that all of the solutions here are difficult. They are ultimately come down to the fact that structurally the economy is incapable here of addressing the issues that faced here. And we're mainly talking about its inability to collect revenue, and particularly from those who own property. And it's from the fact that so few of the country's economic elite really pay anything like their fair share. In fact, much of the time, they don't pay anything at all. But without that kind of addressing of the revenue intake, there doesn't seem to be any really long-term solution. And to address those would be to cut off the lifeline of this elite class who really are the only people who can manage, as I suggested, at this point in time. Let me close then just simply by saying that the economy and the political system are closely intertwined, and that as long as there is as much disarray in the political system, that's inevitably going to impact the economic system.
Muhammad Ali, you said earlier that the military is caught between a rock and a hard place right now, and I wanted to drill down on that in a little bit more detail. How do you think it will respond, and do you think we're likely to see any broader changes in its approach to political affairs?
Well, I mean, the military's approach to governance has evolved over time, right? So we'd seen a situation going back to the 1950s and 60s. We had martial law during the 1980s and then 1999 onwards. So these three military regimes, the Musharraf, Zia, and Ayub Khan, it's also interesting and important to sort of look at geopolitics as well. I mean, and a note worth making here is that all three of them, like elsewhere in the world, were propped up and helped. They didn't come to power with US backing in Pakistan, but they were large beneficiaries of US support. Initially Sito Cento, subsequently against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and then post 9/11, Pakistan being a frontline state, and all the sort of turbulence that occurred. I mean, it was certainly not an easy relationship. But from that model of directly taking over power and building its economic assets, the military has opted or had opted for a hybrid approach. Although in the past as well, like the MQM, the creation of the MQM in Karachi and its stronghold being Karachi and Hyderabad and Sindh was seen in the past to have been a military creation to break the back of the Pakistan People's Party. But now with Imran Khan sort of coming to the fore and him saying that he and the military were on the same page, it might have been a tacit understanding that there are some issues that the military wants to handle, and Imran Khan should not interfere, like foreign policy. So that hybridized model has also not worked, right? So I mean, on the surface of it, we saw post Musharraf, we saw democratic governments. We didn't see any prime minister finish that term with the earlier PMLN government and the PPP government. The courts kind of threw out the prime ministers, but the same party elected a new prime minister. But this time around, we've seen, not only a no confidence vote, but we've seen the PTI dissolve prematurely. So now, I mean, the military and its hybrid sort of model, because it has come under a lot of scrutiny and pressure not to interfere in politics, right? And now it seems that, if there's increasing authoritarianism that Imran Khan is opting for, and his increasingly confrontational path, the status of the Pakistani economy, and the potential chaos that can be unleashed will put the military again in an uncomfortable situation where this time around it might not want to assume the reins of power, but it might need to do so, to avert major chaos. So while there is still room for tinkering and, experimenting with the hybrid mode, I don't think that the military would want to step in and take charge of the country, which it's not a foregone conclusion, but it remains a risk.
But yeah, I know we're running over, but we've mostly focused on domestic dynamics so far. And before we wrap up, I do want to turn to foreign policy. What impact do you think the change in leadership will have on Pakistan's foreign policy agenda, and specifically on U.S.-Pakistan ties?
Well, we are already seeing some indications of where this government is going in terms of foreign policy. So the first trip that the prime minister made with a delegation was to Saudi Arabia. And he met the crown prince there. And I think there is a sort of this question of the country needing economic help, right, at this point in time. So where is it going to come from? Is it the IMF? Is it China? Is it Saudi Arabia? Is it all three? And so we'll see Pakistan, strengthening its relationships, I think, with the US, China, and Saudi Arabia. This government, and in fact, sort of the PMLN, is the party that was in power when CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was launched in 2015. So they've had a good relationship with China, and they'll sort of lean into that. And we know that Bilawal Bhutto has had his first sort of virtual bilateral meeting with the Chinese foreign minister already. The interesting thing, of course, is the relationship with the US. Just before, I talk about where I think that's headed, that has, as is always the case, has been through its ups and downs in recent years, starting from a sort of a low phase in the Trump administration with Imran Khan to a reset where Khan and Trump hit it off. And while that may not have translated into big changes on the ground, Khan and Trump, had a communication channel between them. That communication channel at the very top vanished with the Biden administration, which continued engaging with Pakistan at levels below the White House. But there was no outreach from the White House to Khan, from Biden to Khan. And that was the subject of considerable, I'd say, consternation in Pakistan, to the point where now, of course, we have Imran Khan, before his ouster, starting to point fingers at a U.S. conspiracy theory, alleged conspiracy to oust him. And he has only doubled down on that since his ouster. So we have, I think, a new government that wants a good relationship with the US, but may feel a bit hamstrung by the fact that Khan will use Pakistan's improving relations with America, if they come to fruition, against the Sharifs and against this government, saying, look, they came to power as part of this foreign conspiracy. So it can be used essentially against them, especially for Khan supporters, it will be. So, just to sum up, I think there's this question of whether Biden will engage with Shahbaz Sharif. But already we have seen the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, called Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, the new foreign minister, congratulated him. I think it was a warm conversation from the readout. And importantly, something that had already been launched during the Khan government, this celebration of the 75th anniversary of US-Pakistan relations, is something that, both Pakistan and the Biden administration, the State Department, are pushing forward. So there are avenues of cooperation, including on, I think there will be discussions on Afghanistan, but there are other discussions, including on COVID vaccines and fighting the pandemic, including on, I think, a conversation on food security, something that Blinken has invited Bilawal to. And it could be that there's a trip sooner rather than later that the foreign minister of Pakistan makes to the US. And I think that will sort of maybe right-size this relationship, going to a more stable footing than the kinds of ups and downs that it's seen over the last few years. And of course, going back over the last few decades.
We're short on time, but before we wrap up, I want to get all of your concluding thoughts briefly on where you see things going from here. Starting with you, Marvin.
Well, as I suggested already, I think we're entering a very turbulent period in Pakistan's political and economic scene. The big issue here, of course, is how are things going to be resolved in this, what has become really a confrontation between the ousted PTI party and this coalition. What I'm particularly focused on at the moment here as we look ahead is, are we seeing in Pakistan here a popularism which itself is going to create problems, and a popularist in Imran Khan who is going to have a kind of damaging effect here on politics itself? I don't know what would happen, for example, if there were a really free election and Imran Khan was able to put together a coalition, and it will have to be a coalition government, but one in which he dominates. Are we going to see here a replay of the early 1970s when we had Zulfikar Ali Bhutto essentially becoming, through the use of populism, becoming here a near, for at least for a time, a near dictator, Imran Khan, should he succeed, has got lots of retribution in mind here. I think that would be a really strong effort here to penalize in every possible way his opposition. His ability to dominate the Supreme Court shouldn't be ruled out because Supreme Courts generally go where the power is. As far as the military is concerned, one would expect that this is the real check. But something we haven't discussed here is the military itself is not unified with respect to Imran Khan. Yes, the top brass recognize that many of his actions here have been inimical to the well-being of the military as an institution. At the same time, Pakistan Army, more than ever before, reflects what the people are like. And if the population here buys into conspiracies, if they want, for example, more, and it seems they do, a more independent foreign policy, what else will they follow Imran Khan on? What will be the economic fallout from this? And we have to remember that the only time in Pakistan's history when the military was really put in check was there in the early 1970s. And it came about because the military itself had lost the confidence of the people. We're seeing some of that now. And this is something which has always worried the military because ultimately their strength lies in their popular support. Well, if you get a populist who captures that, then they would find themselves in a very difficult position. And the possibility here, either of the scenario I'm suggesting, or where the military leadership is able to remain cohesive enough to bring off an intervention politically in the form of a coup. So I know it's all very depressing at this point. It's hard to see any silver lining in what is going on now, but perhaps Muhammad Ali and Madiha have some brighter thoughts. I'll leave it at that.
Muhammad Ali, any brighter thoughts?
I don't know if I can give a silver lining, but I certainly found Marvin's reference to the Bhutto era very interesting. But I want to sort of talk about, give my concluding thoughts with sort of the, American perspective in mind. And I would say that, Imran's increasing use of sort of anti-imperialist sentiment created disdain or discomfort in the US. And then there was a sense of relief that, hey, look, the Pakistani military is parting ways with Imran Khan because they realize that, they don't want to put all the eggs in one basket. And the US is a long-standing source of military hardware, etc. But the US does not want to repeat that mistake of then backing, again, a military regime or the military's position just because it's convenient. Right. And I mean, not only in the past, but very recently, other scholars have cited Egypt as an example that the US needs to be wary of in, its support of the Sisi government. And I think the best way of doing that is, having a more human-centric approach, going beyond this very narrow security-dominated lens of contending with Pakistan and using Pakistan to the extent possible for containing the Islamic State threat. And there are so many other issues like climate change, which is a threat multiplier. But having a more human-centric, cooperative approach can help lessen tensions, in South Asia, help lessen, these causes of destabilization and friction. And, when it comes to working on human-centric issues and development issues, I think the US also needs to have a greater rethink because it's been talking about Chinese predatory lending, but there are a lot of people in Pakistan who, talk about the 50, 60 years of US aid lending and World Bank and IMF lending and the elite capture of that. Right, how the market mechanism works hand in glove with elite capture. But that, Alistair, is a much longer conversation for us to have.
Indeed. A conversation for another day, perhaps. Madiha, you've got the last word. Any final thoughts?
Well, I think so much has been covered and such great points brought up. I will just say that to me, the thing to be watching right now is Pakistan's sort of political polarization. I think Pakistan is more dangerously polarized than possibly any other time in at least its recent history. And, there are echoes of this, I think, in the post January 6th era in the US. But in some sense, I think, in the US, there's the test is the institutions are strong enough to withstand it. In Pakistan, whether that is the case is really an open question. And so for this new government, the question will be, can it keep its head down and focus on governing, or is it going to get sort of pulled into the constant confrontation with Khan, which is, sort of destabilizing for the entire country? Or whether, it can actually put its head down and do some of the work that needs to be done, and whether the next election will be a relatively peaceful election, and what comes after that. In some sense, we are in a state of limbo until the next election. And then there's a question of what happens after the election, because there is that question of, if the PTI loses, will they accept those results, right? And so it's a wait and watch situation. I think it's particularly combustible right now. But the question is whether it can settle down and perhaps simmer for a bit, at least until the next election.
We'll have to leave things there for now. But Muhammad Ali, Madiha, Marvin, thank you all for joining the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair.
You can follow all of MEI's coverage of Pakistan on our website at www.mei.edu. That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.